So tonight's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Noach. Noach is the second Torah portion, and it discusses various topics, but primarily, as its name sounds, the story of Noah, of the great builder of the ark. And here's a quick overview of the Torah portion. God instructs Noah, the only righteous man in a world consumed by violence and corruption, to build a large wooden teva, an ark, coated within and without with pitch. A great deluge, a great flood, says God, will wipe out all life from the face of the earth, but the ark will float upon the water, sheltering Noah and his family, as well as 2 members, male and female, of each animal species. Except for the kosher animals, which there were 7 male and 7 female of each animal species. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the waters churn for 150 more days before calming and beginning to recede. The ark settles on Mount Ararat, and from its window Noah dispatches a raven and then a series of doves to see if the waters were abated from the face of the earth. When the ground dries completely, exactly 1 solar year after the onset of the flood, God commands Noah to exit the teva and repopulate the earth. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God. God swears never again to destroy all of mankind because of their deeds, and he sets the rainbow as a testimony of his new covenant with the human race. God also commands Noah regarding the sacredness of life. Murder is deemed a capital offense, and while people are permitted to eat the meat of animals, they are forbidden to eat flesh or blood taken from a living animal. Noah plants a vineyard and becomes drunk on its produce. 2 of Noah's sons, Shem and Yafet, are blessed for covering up their father's nakedness, while his 3rd son, Ham, is punished for taking advantage of his father's debasement. And that was actually that last point, that last story was the topic of discussion of last year's class on the Torah portion of Noah, and how careful one has to be, if I recall correctly, it was on the Torah portion of Noah, how one has to be with what we speak about. But we'll get into tonight's class. And tonight's class is a very interesting topic. And that is this interesting idea, if you go to any yeshiva and sit down at the study hall in a rabbinical seminary, in a rabbinical college, you'll notice that there's lots of people sitting and discussing various Talmudic topics, analyzing very passionately, asking a question, giving an answer, sitting back and thinking about that answer, and then all together 2-3 people getting together and seeing how this answer solves any respective issue, the one that they were discussing, or any other issue in the 2,200 plus pages of the Talmud, or any other book of Jewish law and history. And this idea of study and analytics, really we have not just in rabbinical college, but we have it in academia as well. Walk into any university and there's going to be a professor out front with 150 students or somewhere there, 50 students, depends how popular the professor and the topic is. And the professor is going to be going through this wonderful PowerPoint production on a presentation on whatever topic it may be. And these students are very, very excited. They're spellbound, if it's a good professor, by his excitement. And they know and they're convinced that this wonderful professor will enable them to change the world and humanity forever in whatever topic they're discussing. There's excitement, there's discussion, just like it is in Talmudic discussion. Both groups of students are very, very passionate about their studies. Both are exerting themselves to wrap their heads around the topics of discussion, to get involved in the very subtle details and concepts which are being discussed, to really appreciate the entirety of the subjects they are studying. But seemingly these 2 forms of study, or these 2 groups of students, are 2 entirely different worlds, right? Academia and Torah study. There are 2 opposing worlds, or 2 different worlds. And so today's class is going to be focused on, is there a way, or how can we join these two groups to a degree. The interplay between these two worlds, and to really address the questions of how do religious Jews approach academia and science? How does the Torah approach it? Do we ignore it? Do we oppose it? Do we strive for it? Do we try to understand it? Are we as a people supposed to be anti-science? Are we supposed to be pro-science? What is Torah? Is Torah anti-science? Is Torah pro-science? And so that's what we will be discussing in tonight's class. And we'll begin with the fascinating story in our Torah portion of the Tower of Babel, which is towards the end, actually, of this week's Torah portion. At the time of creation, Adam and Eve, and following with many centuries, most of humanity lived in a single region as one community with a single language. And as a population grew, people decided that they need to find a new place that could accommodate their needs. And so they traveled east and they settled in a valley called Shinar. That was the name of the valley. What happened when they reached this valley? That's when they decided to construct this giant monument to humanity. Text 1a, if you have the books, it's on page 3. If you didn't have the book yet, I know some people asked me about it today. It's available on Amazon. The link in the second email wasn't working, but the link in the first email was. If you'd like the link after to purchase the book, let me know. I do not have any of the books. It comes straight from the printer. It's available on Amazon. And so it's on page 3. So text 1a, it's the end of this week's Torah portion, and it's discussing the building of the Tower of Babel. And the verse tells us as follows. And they said one to another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." So the bricks were to them for stones, and the clay was to them for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the entire earth." Seems innocent. What's going on here? Humanity's progressing. People figured out that they can build with bricks instead of just wood and stones. They figured out that they're able to, this new creation, this new invention, expands their construction abilities and durability and capabilities. They're now able to build much better, much faster, easier. And they decided that they're going to utilize this benefit for the endurance of the human race. For some reason, God doesn't appreciate this project of building this monumental tower, and he decides instead that they're going to learn a lesson that they're not as impressive as they make themselves out to be. And what happens? The verse continues. God says to the heavenly tribunal, to the heavenly court, "Come, let us descend and confuse their language, so that one will not understand the language of his companion." And God scattered them from there upon the face of the entire earth, and they ceased building the city. God said, enough. I'm going to change their language. Suddenly there's going to be 70 languages instead of one. No one's going to understand each other. Chaos is going to emerge, and then everyone will be forced to move. And that is exactly what happened. God came down figuratively, and God caused them to suddenly speak different languages. And the Midrash, if I recall correctly, it's a Midrash that they were all talking one language, and so they were able to build this tower, and they were very involved in building the tower. And then suddenly, miraculously, their languages were changed, and people were speaking one of 70 languages. It sounded like the UN. And so one guy would ask for a hammer, and instead of a hammer, the other guy thought he asked for a brick. So you'd hand him a brick, and the other guy would get upset, and a fight would break out. And slowly but surely, the entire project emerged in chaos. erupted in chaos, and everyone scattered from there. There was nothing left with the building of the Tower of Babel. There was nothing left of their grandiose ideas of building this tower which will rise to heaven. But the question really is, why is it such a problem? Why was it such a bad idea? A group of people come together to advance their technological ability and promote socioeconomic progress. We're all together. Let's build a monument for human endurance, for the human race, how great we are. What was the problem that God did not like about the Tower of Babel? And the short answer is they attempted to use their God-given abilities to do something that was seemingly against God. But what? What was wrong with them building this tower? Instead of celebrating the building of the tower, seemingly it's something to celebrate about. Technological advances, they came up with this idea of the brick. They came up with this idea of building a big tower, which was a novel idea in those times. This is only roughly 1,800 years after creation. This is going back almost 4,000 years. It's a great idea. It's something to celebrate, technological advances. What is so wrong about this idea that God has to put a stop without it, a stop to it? Imagine, if you will, that God will put a stop to scientific advantages and scientific research, right? Imagine life without scientific research, fresh running water, the internet, electricity, vaccines, medicine. So many wonderful ideas have come through scientific research. This seems to be the story of the Tower of Babel, was really humanity celebrating their technological advances at that time, which consisted of the bricks. And now they're able to build taller, stronger, more durable, and with greater ease. It was something that was supposed to be a monument for the greatness of humanity, and God didn't like it and he stopped it. Why? What is wrong with technological or scientific advances? And so we'll get back to that question and the seemingly perplexing idea of the Tower of Babel, but we're going to get back to it at the end of the class. So let's put that on the back burner for a moment, and we're going to introduce a separate idea, an interesting passage from the foundational Kabbalistic work, the Zohar, written in the 2nd century by the great sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whom we celebrate on Lag BaOmer. And this is what it says in the Zohar, in association with a verse of our Torah portion pertaining to the flood of Noah. The Zohar says as follows: in the 600th year of the 6th millennium, the supernal gates of wisdom will be opened, and also the well springs of wisdom below. This will prepare the world for the 7th millennium. Like a person who prepares himself on Friday for Shabbat as the sun begins to wane, so it will be here. This is alluded to in the verse, in the 600th year of Noah's life, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. In this passage, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, 1,800 years ago, is foretelling us events that would take place 16, 17 centuries later. And remarkably, here we are, almost 180 years after that, and we know exactly what the Zohar is referring to. What am I talking about? For those who joined the class, the JLI course, This Can Happen, we discussed this at great length in, I believe it was class 2. But in short, what are we talking about here? The Zohar is talking about as follows. In the 600th year of the 6th millennium, what year are we in now? 5782. We just began 5782. So we are in the 783rd year of the 6th millennium. When was the 600th year of the 6th millennium? Roughly 1840, 1839, 1840. So the Zohar is telling us that in the year 5,600 since creation, which coincides with the year 1839, 1840, two things will happen. The supernal gates of wisdom will be opened. In other words, wisdom of Torah, and also the well springs of wisdom below. There's going to be a burst of secular wisdom, wisdom unassociated seemingly with holiness, just mundane wisdom that will burst forth. And what's its purpose? It's a preparation for the coming of Mashiach, being that the sixth millennium, each millennium is like a day. The sixth millennium is like Friday, and Friday afternoon is when we're really involved in our preparations for Shabbos. And so in the greater cosmic days of the year, the 7 millenniums, which the 7th millennium is the era of Mashiach, in the 6th millennium, in the 600th year, that's already getting close to Mashiach, and so that's a preparation for Mashiach. What are these two things? Where do we see the supernal gates of wisdom were opened and the supernal well springs of wisdom below? So here's the words of the Rebbe, text 3. Evidently, the Zohar is referring to the fact that the gates of wisdom in general and the gates of the Torah's wisdom specifically would open at that time. This did actually occur with regard to worldly wisdom. As for Torah wisdom, we merited in that era the revelation of Torah's inner dimension, a part of the Torah that had previously been hidden and concealed. Let's begin with the first step, the step of the well springs of wisdom below. This is commonly associated with the Industrial Revolution. What was the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution was an explosion of innovation that happened at that time. In the 19th century, but really it started spreading forth in 1840. And I don't know if we have the map here. We don't have the map here, but if you have the book, there's a map on page 6, which is a map actually taken from Britannica, and it's on their website. And on the spread of the Industrial Revolution, Britannica shows, began in England. And then it started spreading out of England in the 1840s. That's when the Industrial Revolution started taking over the world. And it goes through a whole list. The battery was invented in 1800, the electric light in 1809, steam locomotive 1814, the camera 1814, the stethoscope 1816, cement 1824, matches 1826, the microphone 1827, sewing machine, 1830, mechanical calculator, 1835, a glider, 1854, and so on and so forth. Many anesthesia, antiseptics, pasteurization, the washing machine, plastic, traffic light, telephone, carpet washer. These were all inventions of the Industrial Revolution. And it wasn't only in technological advances, it was also in scientific breakthroughs. Certain mathematical and scientific breakthroughs, what enabled the creation of the internet, and many other mathematical and scientific breakthroughs occurred at this similar era, all within this general time frame. An explosion of innovation that mankind hadn't seen before in thousands of years occurred in under 100 years. An explosion of progress after so many millennia without major changes seems to be something that's impossible to predict, yet the Zohar predicted it. It said that in the year 1840, and some explained that it doesn't mean that year, it means that decade, there's going to be an explosion of worldly wisdom. Following that, we have the second point that's mentioned, or really in the Zohar, it's mentioned first, but we have the idea of supernal gates of wisdom will be opened. What happened in 1840? In 1840 was this real seismic change in the esoteric development of Torah. You see, the esoteric aspect of Torah was always around. It was given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. It was studied by the great sages throughout all the ages. But it's just that it was studied just by a select few sages in each generation. And very slowly it trickled through to the lower level sages, if you will. But almost never did it come to the everyday person, to you and me. Almost never. It stayed by the great sages. And slowly but surely it started getting out there. Even with the creation of Hasidism, with the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, following him, his student and successor, the Maggid of Mezrich, in the mid 18th century, late 18th century. It still stayed somewhat hidden and not so readily and easily accessible. Then came the third generation of Hasidism, the late 18th century, beginning in the early 19th century. And now Hasidic thought and Kabbalah, easy, readily available, started to be printed. Chabad was at the forefront of spreading the intellectual concepts of Hasidism, of the esoteric aspect of Torah, beginning with Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, that's his drawing of him, and with the printing of the Tanya in 1796. Following that, second most important book of foundational Hasidism to be spread to the masses, for everyone to be able to have it readily available, codified, organized, easily accessible, was printed all around the year 1840, 1837, and 1848. 2 volumes of a single publication. It was called 2 different names. One was called Torah, or the other Likutei Torah. That was because of the Tsarist censors that didn't allow books to be printed in those days. It's a long story for a different time. But it's 2 separate books of the same, 2 volumes of the same book were printed at that time. And following that, it just got broader, wider, easier, more excited, more accessible, like it never was in the past. Not only that, this mid-1800s period was an explosive time for growth for the Hasidic movement. Up until that point, it was just a select few people, a small band of pious Jews in the backwoods of Ukraine, and it became this mainstream part of Judaism of most of Europe at the time. And so these 2 major shifts is what the Zohar is referring to, that there's going to be a burst. Text 2, there's going to be the supernal gates of wisdom will be open, and also the well springs of wisdom below. This was predicted by the Zohar in the 2nd century, 1700 years before it actually occurred, and it occurred just as he had said. But seemingly, the Zohar is implying that there's a link between these 2. In other words, this advance above of supernal wisdom, this burst of supernal wisdom, is associated with the burst of worldly wisdom. Why does the Zohar link them? They seem to be 2 totally opposite ideas. One is spiritual, one is mundane, one is materialistic, one is more refined. What is the Zohar telling us? And linking the 2, how is the advance above aligned with the advance below? To understand this idea of how they're linked together, let's understand how Torah and science really work together. And how perhaps Torah isn't, as some may think, anti-science. Now, it's important to understand that generally speaking, in Western culture, it's generally understood through, religion is generally understood through the Christian terms, which might explain the notion that the idea that there's the popular notion that extremely religious people are adverse to science. And I encounter that all the time, and I have to explain to people that it isn't that way. But why do we have that notion? Because generally religion is seen through Christian terms, and it's starkly different than Judaism. You see, the one main difference between Christianity and Judaism is Judaism is based on action, not so much on what we believe, but more on what we do. Christianity doesn't have that many things about what a person does. It's about what they believe, right? If someone believes a certain set of beliefs, then they're saved. If you don't believe in those beliefs, then you're not saved, you're doomed. But it's about a belief system. And that belief system, which I don't understand much about it, is just in preparing tonight's class, I had this understanding. But the whole business of religion in other religions, in Christianity and in other religions, it runs an entirely different track than the mundane, tangible world. It's an entirely different track. And so if someone has that track, in other words, religion is only about belief and blind faith. Faith and blind faith alone. It's not about action. It's not about the tangible world. It's all about blind faith. Then it's obvious that it's going to affect the way a religious person might view science and academia, which is why many Christian thinkers from its early days till contemporary times understood that faith operated on an entirely separate strata from academia and science, and it was impossible to bring the two together. Judaism, by definition, is about practice. Judaism, by definition, is about practice which takes place in the mundane reality. And so automatically then, the Jewish approach cannot be to reject science, because science is the observation of natural phenomena. And if science is the observation of natural phenomena, then the natural world is an important component of our belief system. Then science runs hand in hand with the Jewish belief. So how does Judaism view academia? Judaism is inquisitive, pro-logic, and pro-science. Let's get into it. Here's text 4 from Rabbi Norman Lamm, and he writes as follows. Tertullian said, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What agreement is there between academy and church?" For this Latin church father, the gulf between them was unbridgeable. This assertion is of one piece with his famous statements, credo quia absurdum est, that he believed because it was absurd. Such anti-rationalism never found a warm and hospitable reception among classical Jewish thinkers. Now, this quote of credo quia absurdum est, that he believed because it was absurd, seems to be a misattribution, but this idea of faith and blind faith are more commonly associated with Christian and Christian sources than with Jewish and Jewish sources. Because this idea of anti-rationalism was never accepted by classical Jewish thinkers, which is why scientific knowledge was very common amongst the greatest rabbis throughout history. Maimonides, Nachmanides, Ibn Ezra, Barbanel, the Ramchal, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Hasidism, the Rebbe, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, many sages throughout the ages had tremendous scientific knowledge and were very involved in the sciences. Not only that, we can take this a step further. Not only is Torah okay with science in some kind of ambivalent way, but the truth is, if you think about it, Judaism, Torah to a degree, is what enables science, as opposed to pagan religions. You see, if pagan religions was all about in Greek mythology, all these ideas were this idea that there was this battle between gods and random gods created different aspects and so on and so forth, which really means, based on those ideas, that there's no rhyme or reason to anything in creation, because it wasn't a single entity that created everything. And so how can you get to the bottom of something? There's no single entity which associates one aspect with another aspect. It's all one big chaotic creation. But once you have Judaism and the Torah that tells us that there was one creator, and the creator is the one that created everything, that means that there is a rhyme and reason to everything. And if there's a rhyme and reason to everything, including nature with which God created, now let us get to the bottom of nature and how nature works, also known as science. In the words of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, text 5. The account of creation in the first chapter of Genesis is stunningly original, quite unlike any other in antiquity. There are no contending forces, no battles of the gods, no capricious spirits. God speaks and the universe comes into being. God is not in nature, but above it, transcending it and ordering it according to his word. Nature has no will or set of wills of its own. This was an immense intellectual leap. If God created the world, then it is, in principle, intelligible. The myths of irrationality have been dispelled. In other words, what Rabbi Sachs is arguing, and many others before him and after him have expressed, is that one of the gifts of modern thought that monotheism taught the world is the basis of what we now call science. So not only doesn't Torah negate science and accept it in some sort of ambivalent way, it's almost as if Torah is what gives room for scientific study. It gives us a much greater appreciation that there is a rhyme and reason for all of creation, and to appreciate the greatness of the designer of the world. And so the first thing that we've set straight is that Torah is not only not anti-science, but on the contrary, it's quite pro-science. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone should go ahead and, or maybe it does. Does that mean that every yeshiva student should go ahead and enroll in the local college to take some science classes? Does that mean that we are all obligated by Torah to go and become scientists? Maybe we should all, maybe I should drop being in the rabbinate or at least become a rabbi doctor. Should I go become a scientist? Is that for everyone? So to be sure, there are concerns. There are concerns with studying science from a Jewish perspective, from a religious perspective. There are concerns which we will enumerate a little bit later in the class that come along with immersing in secular studies, including in the sciences. But under certain conditions, or to achieve certain worthy goals, secular studies, scientific studies are not only necessary, but in some cases, they are actually part of a mitzvah itself. There's a fascinating letter, I think it's a letter from the 1950s, where the Rebbe enumerates, I don't remember exactly when, it's in volume 3 of the Rebbe's letters, but I believe it's from the 1950s, where the Rebbe enumerates various situations where studying science is supported by Torah, and in some cases, that studying of science is a mitzvah or part of a mitzvah in itself. Text 6, here's a letter from the Rebbe. It's a little small, but I'll read it. Science can be understood from within Torah study. So the first point the Rebbe says is that there's science in Torah itself. An intelligent person can understand everything about a building by looking at a blueprint, right? An architect looks at the blueprint, a contractor looks at the blueprint, and they see a building. I look at a blueprint and I see a bunch of lines and numbers and smudged ink. That's what I see when I look at a blueprint. But when a contractor or an architect looks at a blueprint, they see a building. So too, the Torah is the blueprint of the world, the Midrash tells us. And if so, someone looking in the Torah understands science. As described in the Talmud, continues the Rebbe. Through his Torah study, the great sage Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania was able to determine the duration of a snake's pregnancy. It just doesn't get more abstract scientific than that. Likewise, as it states in the Midrash, Shmuel, the great sage, and Rabbi Hoshaya were able to learn all about astronomy through their Torah study. So that's the first type of permissible scientific study, which is seemingly for great sages. And really for anyone, if we study Torah enough, we'll pick up the certain scientific ideas. Then the Rebbe continues a second example. There are cases where the Torah explicitly commands us to study secular topics. For example, the commandment to calculate the Jewish calendar. Right? We got to understand how the moon works, how the sun works, how astronomy works, the degrees, the constellations, and everything that goes along with astronomy. And astronomy isn't a Torah topic. It isn't a divine topic. It's a scientific study. And the Torah actually tells us that we have a command from the Torah commandment. It's a mitzvah to calculate the Jewish calendar. So here we have a commandment in the Torah, which is based on studying a secular study. Another example where Torah encourages the study of, or Torah allows it, when a person is in a place where Torah study is forbidden, they are obligated to divert their minds to other kinds of wisdom, such as business. Fourth example, secular study is permitted when one lacks the secular knowledge required to properly understand their Torah study or to perform a mitzvah. Like the great sage Rav, who apprenticed with a shepherd for 18 months. And we'll get to that in a moment. This kind of secular research is not considered Torah study, nor is it considered a mitzvah, but it is considered a preparatory step that facilitates Torah and mitzvot. And finally, academic proficiency to the degree necessary and no more for earning a livelihood, or when one uses academics themselves as a profession, this is considered a necessary means for a permissible end. And I'm going to elaborate on these 5 points that the Rebbe mentions here, what they mean and how they can be applied. The first one is pretty straightforward. The idea is science within Torah. That engaging, the first permissible instance of engaging in the sciences is when science is in Torah itself. Second point that the Rebbe mentions was that sometimes Torah itself requires hardcore scientific study. For example, in the calculation of the calendar. And here's a quote from the Talmud. To that end, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said in the name of Bar Kapara, anyone who knows how to calculate astronomical seasons and the movement of constellations and does not do so, the verse says about him in Isaiah, they do not take notice of the work of God and they do not see his handiwork. Rabbi Shmuel Menachmeni said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, from where is it derived that there is a mitzvah incumbent upon a person to calculate astronomical seasons and the movement of constellations, as it was stated in Deuteronomy, and you shall guard and perform, for it is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. Which wisdom and understanding is there in the Torah that is in the eyes of the nations? We must conclude this is the calculation of astronomical seasons and the movements of constellations. So the result is that in the middle of studying Torah law, we find a passage that talks about something purely scientific. Not only that, Maimonides, in his discussion of the Torah law, of calculating the calendar, he actually mentions a debate that took place amongst secular scientists related to astronomy. Here's a quote from Maimonides in his Book of Laws, where he's discussing the laws of setting up the Jewish calendar, and he says as follows: there is a difference of opinion among the sages of Israel concerning the length of a solar year. Some sages, the opinion of Shmuel, the great sage, maintain that it is 365 days and 1/4 of a day, in other words, 6 hours. Others, the opinion of Rav Ada, maintain that it is slightly less than that figure. In other words, it's 365, slightly less than 6 hours. There is also a difference of opinion among the wise men of Greece and Persia concerning this matter. So that's a second example when it is permissible to engage in scientific studies for the purpose of a mitzvah. It's actually a mitzvah to engage in this aspect of the sciences. Third example was in a place where one is not allowed to study Torah, and we don't want to just waste our time. Text A, B, and C, it's from the Code of Jewish Law and 2 commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law. Code of Jewish Law says as follows: it is forbidden to even think words of Torah in the bathroom, bathhouse, or other unclean place, i.e. a place where excrement or urine is present, right? A barn or a horse's stable, etc. Therefore, where Torah study is forbidden, one should make his business calculations so as to keep the mind occupied and avoid inappropriate thoughts. On Shabbat, when thinking about business is forbidden, one should think about nice buildings or artwork and other such matters that are allowed on Shabbat. Time is valuable. You can't think, you're going to spend time thinking about something, think about Torah. It's God's wisdom. And we're commanded to study Torah as much as we can. Now, you're in a place where you can study Torah. Don't just waste your time reading random books or thinking about other things, because that can lead one place to another. Occupy your mind with good things, with important things, with things that are beneficial, like thinking about science. In the restroom, keep an encyclopedia, keep a textbook on psychology, on astronomy, on some other of the sciences. Let's keep our minds occupied with something positive. That's what it says in Jewish law. And that's the third example that the Rebbe mentions, where it's permissible and seemingly not just permissible, but also encouraged from a Jewish viewpoint to study the sciences. The fourth example was to study science in order to properly perform a mitzvah or understand Torah. And the example we gave was the great sage Rav, who became an apprentice to a shepherd for 1.5 years. He was a great sage with a long flowing white beard. I can imagine, I didn't see him, but long flowing white beard. And he looked like that refined sage, the proverbial man on top of the mountain. And instead of delving his time and his mind in Torah study, he went to apprentice by a shepherd for 1.5 years. Why did he do that? So he can understand animals when it comes to the blemishes of sacrifices in the temple. So in order to understand an aspect of Torah, he went ahead and studied this aspect, the animals. The words of the Talmud, Rav said, I apprenticed with a shepherd for 18 months to be able to know which blemish is a permanent blemish and which is a temporary blemish. Something equivalent today would be a great sage going ahead, a great rabbi going ahead and studying electrical engineering to properly apply the laws of Shabbos. Or a rabbi taking a course in food science to properly apply the laws of kashrus. Or courses in fertility medicine to help struggling couples conceive while keeping the laws of family purity, and so on and so forth. This is done commonly. There are many rabbi doctors who study unique areas in the sciences or in various areas. Fertility experts is a great example. There are many rabbis, not many, but there are a number of rabbis that are great fertility experts in the sciences and the medicine of it, in order to be able to work hand in hand with the Jewish laws and with couples to enable them to conceive while keeping the laws of family purity. So that's the fourth example that the Rebbe gives of studying Torah in order to perform a mitzvah. Studying sciences which will lead to the performance of a mitzvah in a better fashion. And finally was to get a job. Of course, that's permitted because according to Torah, one has to support their family. So if one wants to become a doctor, they have to properly study medicine and properly study the associated sciences. And if so, studying science now becomes an aspect of fulfilling the mitzvah. So those are 5 examples that the Rebbe gives where studying the sciences are important and in some cases actually part of a mitzvah. But ultimately, a Jew must remember that Torah is the ultimate eternal wisdom, unchanged by the limits of time, space, and the God-given limits of nature. And any foray into secular studies must be within that context, because if we lose sight of that context, that can lead to problems. See, there's 2 main issues. There are a number of issues, but there are 2 main issues when it comes to the study of sciences. Obviously, as we explained over here, it's not science itself that Torah is an issue with. On the contrary, Torah accepts science and agrees with science and encourages it, and in some cases encourages the study. But there are 2 issues that can become from studying of sciences or studying secular studies in general. The first issue is the issue of relationships. You see, Judaism is not just technical things. We have to do this, we have to do that. Judaism is mainly a relationship between us and God and vice versa. That's what it's about. It's an intimate relationship between each one of us and God. A relationship is affected not just by what the parties are doing, and perhaps not just, but even more importantly, by how they think and feel. And if so, safeguarding our minds from certain ideas is a critical mechanism in maintaining this intimate relationship or the integrity of our intimate relationship with God. That's how it works in any relationship between spouses. That's why halacha, Jewish law, puts so many safeguards between spouses, not just what they can or can't do, but even places where they could and shouldn't be, things that they're not supposed to think about in order not to break that deep, intimate bond between spouses. An unmarried man and unmarried woman can't be in the same room on their own if they're not related. Siblings can, but right, the laws of yichud. But why? There's nothing wrong. They're not doing anything. She's a secretary and he's the plumber. Doesn't matter. It's not allowed. When a spouse is being intimate, physically intimate with their partner, they're not allowed to think about someone else. Our relationship with God is a deep relationship. Getting intellectually involved in beliefs and theology of other religions or non-Torah disciplines can disturb this intimate space between a Jew and God. And therefore, a Jew is commanded not only to guard our speech and our action, but also to guard our hearts and our eyes and our mind from undesirable influences. Like the Torah says with the mitzvah of tzitzis. There's the text 10. This shall be fringes for you, and when you see it, you will remember all the commandments of God to perform them, and you shall not wander after your hearts and after your eyes, after which you are going astray. Let's not get intellectually involved in other things. And this is a very important point to keep in mind when it comes to secular education. Yes, science is just science and it's observable facts, and it's all true. But secular education includes so much more than just raw science. There's subtle influences, subtle agendas, sometimes not so subtle influences and agendas. And not to mention the cultural influences, which find their ways into the classrooms, into the science books, into the textbooks, into the lectures, the YouTube videos, whatever type of lectures one may be participating in person or online, et cetera, et cetera. There's those subtle agendas that the presenters have. And many of them don't align with our relationship with God. And so even in those 5 scenarios where studying sciences is encouraged by Torah, one must be really, really careful to block out the noise around it and to make sure that it doesn't invade the sacred space of a Jew's relationship with God, even if one thinks it doesn't lead to any practical change. Not only that, it can lead to practical change, and it does very often lead to practical change. In colleges and universities and schools around the world, of course, but even in our own little 4 corners, in our own little homes, in our books that we read, and in the lectures that we watch, the influences that can have. We have to be careful from it. We have to consider what we're learning, how we're learning it, and how it's affecting our attitude and behavior. A second important point is a deep influence that the mind has on the person. What does a hacker do? It goes for the chip of the computer, right? It goes through the mind of the computer. If you had a robot, you need the mind of the robot, not the hand of the robot, not the foot of the robot. The mind of the robot is what you have to control. If people had computer chips, armies of the world would be going wild to make sure that the enemies don't control the minds of people, because it's the mind what controls the rest of us. And I'll give you an example. If someone's wasting their time, and instead of wasting, what are they wasting their time with? They're wasting their time because they're playing computer games. They're just playing Bejeweled or some other of these iPod smartphone games. So it may be a waste of time. Sometimes it's important. It's great stress release. It may be a waste of time, but it's just that, it's a waste of time. But now, contrast that with a professor teaching a bunch of young, impressionable students, spouting harmful, vile ideas and getting a person into a certain mindset that can have detrimental impact on them. Instead of wasting their time, they're wasting their time watching YouTube videos of hateful ideas. How strong a person thinks they may be, those ideas creep into their minds and they start running deep. And here's the key point, says the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, text 11. I know we're a little bit over time, but we're nearing the end. The Alter Rebbe says as follows. Intellectual contamination is greater than the contamination of idle speech. For speech only impacts the emotions. It does not, however, contaminate the intellectual faculties in a person's soul. For it is just words of foolishness and ignorance, right? And some people are sitting and gossiping and wasting their time. It may be wasting their time, but that's just it. That's where it stops. Inasmuch as these are not intellectual matters, the intellect remains uninvolved and untainted. Not so in the case of various secular studies. Thereby a person impacts and contaminates his divine soul's intellectual faculties. And that's why the context of this statement of the Alter Rebbe is, in Tanya, is why it's important not to study secular studies. And then he concludes, the exception is one who employs these secular disciplines as a useful instrument, as a means of earning a more affluent livelihood with which to be able to serve God, or unless he knows how to apply the secular disciplines in the service of God or to his better understanding of his Torah. This is why Maimonides and Nachmanides of blessed memory and their peers engage in such studies. And that's why the Alter Rebbe is saying it's so crucial to be mindful when determining what sort of secular studies we're going to engage with. We must be focused on the purpose of the study and the broader context that purpose serves, living a life as a faithful, productive, and engaged Jew with our head in the right place, Torah and commandments and God. Now we're going to get back to the Tower of Babel. Why was the Tower of Babel frowned upon? Now that we understand the purpose of secular studies, now we understand that Torah is not anti-science. Rather, Torah is pro-science done in the right manner. If we let science get to our head and we say, you know what, science comes to the realization that there is no God, we're missing the whole point. We studied science in the wrong manner. And that's what happened with the Tower of Babel. Yes, they came up with these great innovations, the brick and the idea of building a tower. That was a great idea, but they missed the point. They missed the point. The point is that as we get through these technological advances and the more we study science, the more we come to recognition that there's a God and that God created this magnificent universe. And this magnificent universe is all about us discovering God, studying his Torah, and performing his mitzvahs. And this is precisely the reason why the Zohar links the explosion of modern science with the explosive spread of Hasidus in the 19th century. Because for the world to properly use and benefit from modern science, it must have the tools to incorporate that knowledge in a healthy, godly way. And so as the spiritual underpinnings of the universe were disseminated, the study of Hasidus, the study of the esoteric aspect of Torah, and as God's role in creation became more understood in the sphere of Torah, the world became mature enough to begin a new era of scientific advance. Does that mean that all the scientists from 1840 suddenly are believers in God? No, of course not. Many took their studies in the wrong direction and perverted science to be a replacement for God. But the stage was also set for science itself to become more in tune with the godly reality. And just two quick examples. The first example is the discovery that there's one core to everything. See, Torah always taught that everything is God. And that the essence of everything is always this one core, the divine essence in everything. And from a scientific view, 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, it seemed absurd. But as time went on, it was less and less absurd. Because although there were many, many elements that were being discovered, at the base of everything, there was discovered that there's the atom. There's the human genome, the DNA, there's the core, the base of everything, which is all has one essential core, which all leads to the idea that it's all created by God, by one essential core. Another example is the internet. On the one hand, the internet is something that can be used for something no good. Just like the Tower of Babel, they use their technological advances for something no good. But on the other hand, as we are doing right now, the internet can and should be used for good things. And it also enables us to understand various Torah concepts. The ethics of our fathers tells us that a person should always look at three things and it will make sure, if you meditate, contemplate on these three things, a person will not come to transgression. What are those three things? We should know what is above us, a seeing eye, a listening ear, and that all that we do is being inscribed in a book. The sages said this 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago was nearly impossible to understand. It was an abstract idea that we knew God saw everything, hears everything, and knows everything that we're doing. Nowadays, with the internet, we know that we're being watched and we're being listened to and everything's written down, right? Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp went down yesterday for 6 hours. The world almost stopped. We understand that everything that we do, hear, or see is on the internet. It's there. It enables us to understand this divine concept that has always been there. So just to tie it all together, and we'll conclude. Sometimes we can get carried away that science is powerful, science replaces God, And religion is anti-science. But Judaism teaches that on the contrary, not only is science not, Torah is not anti-science, Torah seemingly led the way for science to become the idea that it was all designed by God with a rhyme and a reason. And so science is this powerful tool that is neutral and it can be used in the wrong way by scientists trying to show that it replaces God, or it can be used in the right way to prove nature, to understand nature, and to come to the bottom of it, which it will ultimately, that nature was created by God. It can promote godliness in very significant ways and in ways that we will never be able to reach without science. And so that's what this week's Torah portion teaches us.